This is the place for history on KY3, and we have an author in today, Susan Croce Kelly, and we're talking about your book. It's about a Springfieldian who did travel, it did work in other places, but essentially came back here and made a life, Lucille Morris Upton. So before we go into her life, what in your life made you think this is going to be a great topic for a book about this woman?
I had met Lucille, I got to know Lucille when I was a reporter here 50 years ago at the News Leader. And she would come in, she was long retired, but she was doing a column called The Good Old Days about what happened 50 years before, that had run in the Sunday paper for 40 years. She was long retired, but the paper was still there. Of course, this was pre-internet, so she would come in every week with her column. And my friend Mike O'Brien, who was the city editor at the time, she would hand him her column, and when I asked him about it, he just kind of went like this, and he said, it was great, but if I needed to shorten it, like by even 2 lines to make it fit in the paper, he said she would just be irate. She was a woman who knew her own mind.
She would give him the what for, as you might say.
But she had done so many things, and she was so interesting that later, after I retired from working every day, I'd written one book and I was looking for something else, people had said, you know, somebody needs to write a book about Lucille. And I was living at the Lake of the Ozarks and came down and interviewed people I had known here. Dale Freeman, who was managing editor of the paper then, Mike O'Brien, like I said, Bob Linder, who was a photographer at the paper, several others. John Hulston, who was an attorney in town. Other people who had known Lucille. Yeah. And so I had all these notes from 20 years ago. And then when we lived at the lake, later, I thought, okay, it's time to write the book about Lucille. And so I started in. Her papers were readily available. She had left them to the State Historical Society, and they had microfilmed them and given them back.
Oh, okay.
And she had a niece and 2 nephews that had the papers, and as I talked to people, they would say, I've got some papers of Lucille's, would you like them? And so I ended up with a whole lot of original information, which is all now digitized through the Springfield Library Center.
So you had primary sources and secondary sources.
I did.
And sources on top of sources and personal information
right. And
to
then
go.
I got to know her, you know, like I said, really well when I was a reporter. But it was amazing. I mean, she wrote letters to her best friend. I can't remember. I never did figure out how she did it because they were typed. They weren't copies. And so it was her opinion about everything that was going on and everything that she was writing about. And I don't know if she then handwrote them before she sent them to her friend, but the letters were there. She wrote speeches. I mean, she gave a lot of talks and she wrote them out, and they were in a little notebook. So there was just mountains of information.
Well, we're going to get to why you feel she's important to this area and the case you make in the book about why she's important. But let's go back in time and talk a little bit about her childhood. I understand she wasn't born in the city of Springfield, or didn't grow up really in the city of Springfield.
No, she was born in Dadeville. And I kind of need to say she wasn't a hillbilly. She lived in town. She was a town girl. Her family had come to the region, like a lot of people from Tennessee, her grandparents, or her great-grandparents on both sides. And her own parents had a little house on her grandfather's farm. Her dad died when she was only 9 years old. So and her mother never remarried. So she grew up knowing that she was going to have to take care of herself one way or another. She planned to be a teacher. When she went to Drury.
She went to school here in town.
Yes, she went to Drury, and she became a teacher when she was 19 at the school that she had gone to in Dadeville. And there she met another teacher who was from up around Waynesville. And they fell in love. And he told her that he wasn't really going to be a teacher, that he was saving his money so he could go west and be a newspaper reporter.
Ah, okay.
And she saved his letters. I mean, the mountains of original material I had was terrific. Because he was a reporter, he was a very good letter writer. And it became clear as I looked at his letters and the trajectory of her life that she really didn't fall in love with him. She fell in love with the idea of being a newspaper reporter. But he left town during World War I. He was in the Army, never left the U.S., and then he got a job in Tulsa, and hence the letters that he wrote her. And she would visit him, but they had a falling out, and
that was it.
That was it. She taught for another year or two, and then she found a teaching job in New Mexico. Who was looking Roswell, New Mexico, pre-ETs.
And this was what time frame?
1923.
23.
Yeah.
So, okay, she's on the move, she's independent.
Absolutely.
She's teaching.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In 1923.
And she, Roswell was looking for teachers from the East, and she rode what was called the teacher train out west. And every time I say that, I have pictures of the old Western movies with the stagecoach pulling into town and the school marm in the back of the stagecoach and the handsome cowboy, taking you around the stagecoach. But she, anyway, went to Roswell, which was almost more of a farm town than a Western town. It was a big farming area. And she told me one time that she shocked the people because she didn't live with a family like teachers usually do. And she lived in a hotel or a rooming house independently. But she made it through. She had a good year. They wanted her to come back. And she, by this time, decided she wanted to go to journalism school. So she hitched a ride home with a friend from Missouri who said, "It's okay, I'll take you home, but I want to go to Denver first and look around." And they got to Denver. The friend went sightseeing, and Lucille thought, well, if I'm going to go to journalism school, maybe I can get a job. She applied at the Denver Post, and they said, no, they didn't have any openings, but try the Denver Express, a smaller paper across town. And there's several recordings of Lucille having been interviewed by people at Channel 3 and different places. And to hear her tell it, she said, I went into the Express office and I talked to the editor and I told him I wanted a job, but I had no experience. I'd never been to journalism school. And she would get tense when she talked about it. And he said, that's fine. I like to train my own people. And he hired her.
Wow.
And so she started as the lowest of the lowest of the low on a newspaper. She was the advice to the lovelorn columnist.
Oh.
And her columns were interesting because as the year progressed, they became, mostly she was giving advice to young women. And by the end of the year, she was saying, make up your own mind and do it yourself. Which I think reflected her own attitudes.
Independent spirit, yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But her column was really interesting because occasionally there would be a recipe. Somebody would have written in and asked for a recipe. And one time there was a notice that there were puppies available at somebody's house. So it was really a local paper.
Yeah. So she stays there a little while, and is her next stop back here?
No, she stayed there for about a year, and then she got really tired of being the lovelorn columnist.
Yeah.
There was also a vendetta going on between the KKK and her editor. And I think that was true in the 20s. The Klan was pretty big, and they were moving widely out west. And I think that was part of it, that she just wanted to get away from that. But she looked for a job and found one in El Paso, which wasn't too far from Roswell. I mean, you say, why El Paso? But I was fascinated, because as I did the book, I had to look up about these places where she was and the times. And El Paso was a real crossroads, as you can imagine, right there on the border. There were people from all over the world. There were the Chinese who had come with the railroads. There were Europeans. The reporters there were there, it looked like, for 2 or 3 different reasons. Some of them because they'd had too many smoke-filled rooms on the East Coast, and they were there in the health sanatoriums, drying out.
Right.
Some of them were there because it was on the border and they could go to Juarez and drink because it was during Prohibition. And some of them were just on their way from one place to another, as she said many times. That was the days when newspaper reporters could pick up and go to a new place and get another job as they worked their way up the ladder. And I looked up some of those people, and they became college professors. One of them was the managing editor at the Los Angeles Times. I mean, one of them was a Pulitzer Prize nominee. They were big time. And El Paso was just that kind of a place. And one of them at least one of them had worked in Europe, and he helped her get a job with the International News Service in London. So she quit her job in El Paso and came home to tell her family goodbye. Her mother was sick, she had an appendicitis, and she just never left.
She stayed here.
She stayed here. She started writing freelance articles for the Kansas City Star and the Post-Dispatch. And then when she really decided to stay, she applied for jobs. And they wouldn't hire her because she was a woman.
Hmm.
And
there's a but coming here. But
well, but one thing, they had women on their staff doing different things, and Lucille wanted to be a news reporter, which I think was the difference. And the other thing, she was not heartbroken. She was really aggravated at their attitude. And she got a job in Springfield at the Leader, the old first newspaper in town, I think it was.
Right. So does she become a first in any of these steps with the teacher, the Denver, El Paso, no, not a first.
No, there were women. There was Denver Post had some women that were really well known, investigative reporters and political reporters. At the, I think it was even at the Express, there was a woman who had been there before her who had gone east. Mm-hmm. And when she got to Springfield, she found out that that woman, Dosha Carroll, was coming back to the Springfield to work there. And they became best friends. She was the one that she wrote to over many, many years as Dosha's career moved her in and out of Springfield and then to Japan and San Francisco. But there were women around, and I was just flabbergasted, like I told you earlier. That was the big takeaway from my research, mm-hmm. was that yes, she was a pioneer, but not the way I thought she was. You know, she was a pioneer because she was doing what she was doing kind of on her own terms. But the fact that there was a woman on the newspaper was not news.
She did cover some really big stories in Springfield history, and at least one where the male editors were thinking, oh, this is too much for a woman. A massacre I'm thinking of.
She was the first woman who was assigned to the courthouse and the jail.
Okay.
As a regular beat. So she went around and she talked about walking into the sheriff's office to find out what was going on every day. And she said it really upset the sheriff because this was an old boys coffee place, you know, and they finally got used to her. And one day she was there and the sheriff and a bunch of his deputies left and they said, we're gonna have a story for you later. So when she was back at the office later that afternoon, word came that the sheriff and 5 of his deputies had been murdered at the Young farm west of town, and it was called the Young Brothers Massacre. And when I looked into that, that was the biggest killing of police officers right up to 9/11, all through the 20th century. It was huge news. Never mind just here, it was huge news all over the country. And the 2 young brothers that had done the shooting, they were suspects in a murder, and they stole a car and went south. So the news people all over the country were following the story because they didn't know where they were, and they ended up in Houston in a like an Airbnb, and the owner figured out who they were and called the police, and they figured that out and shot each other
before they could be captured.
Before they could be captured. And Lucille, of course, was part of that story. Every reporter in town was part of that story. But
she was on it.
She was on it, and she was the first, the first one.
She has this great career in newspaper work and inspires others, I'm sure. And at some point, she gets interested in Wilson's Creek National Battlefield.
Right.
And it isn't at that time like we know it today, kind of a park where you can go out there, you can bike, you can walk, you can get interpretive visits from the rangers. It's just kind of land, and everyone knows the battle happened there, right?
Right.
So how does she help shape that into the park it is today?
She started at the Leader in 1926. In 1929, she was assigned to go out to a reunion of the battle, and she got out there, and excuse me. And she talked to people who had, been on, veterans who had been on both sides, and she talked to women who his family had been there in the homes around the edges, and she heard stories, and she wrote a column afterwards, and she said, all my life I'd heard about Wilson's Creek. She said, my mother had an uncle that was killed there, and her father had two much older brothers who had been involved in the Civil War. One had been a St. Louis businessman and raised a company and gone to Texas because he was fought on the Confederates and he didn't want to end up fighting anybody he knew. And the other one was a farmer in Dadeville and raised a group of home guards. So the Civil War was not unknown. And
to her,
to her, I mean, she was born only 30 years after it ended. But she said when she got to the reunion and listened to these people and actually saw where the battle was, she said she never, you know, it totally she had an emotional reaction. And from then on, she worked hard to make sure that people remembered the battle and then to support the efforts to make it into a national battlefield.
And she spends the next several years, not just years, but decades getting things rolling. How does that take shape over that time?
First, a disclaimer. She never was part of anything.
Right.
She was in the corner taking notes.
She kind of helped prod things along, though, based on what I've read.
She kept it in the news. She kept people aware of what was going on. But John Hulston told me, he said she would never be she would never serve on a committee. She would never do any of that. And when she was in Denver, there was, to go back, there was a big convention of, what was it called, National Women's Party. They were trying to get the ERA passed, the Equal Rights Amendment passed, which of course still hasn't passed. But she wanted to interview the women there, and they said, you have to join, and then you can interview us. So she joined, interviewed them, and quit. And at that time, she wrote, and she told people later, she said, I was a reporter. I shouldn't have been part of it. I shouldn't be part of anything because I'm supposed to be objective.
Right.
And she had that attitude. But that did not mean that she didn't pick and choose what she wrote about. And certainly Wilson's Creek was very important to her.
She kept this at the forefront for people here in Springfield, and it really caught the attention of some of the important people in town.
Right, right. Yeah. And today is apparently the 50th or the 75th anniversary of the Wilson's Creek Battlefield Foundation, which started in 1950. And her two big allies were John Hulston, the attorney, and Ellie Metter, who was a history professor and a political science professor, and just a general civic leader in this part of the country. And they were both, for years, had been pushing for Wilson's Creek to become a battlefield, but they were involved in the formation of the foundation. And they decided they were going to raise money to buy at least the core acres where General Nathaniel Lyon had been killed. And it was a huge process. They even got school kids. You know, they did a pinning brigade to make sure that everybody knew what was going on and was interested. And they got support from I don't know, real estate people in St. Louis and church councils. I mean, just a huge pouring out of support to make Wilson's Creek a national battlefield. And it didn't work. They had the money, they bought the acres, but it didn't work. It took another, I don't know, 7 years, I think, before they finally got recognition that Wilson's Creek would become a national battlefield.
To go back to that, her role in this, so she's not on the board, she's not contributing in that type of way, but without her, does this stay in the public eye? Does this ball keep kind of rolling? Does her prodding, without that, does it happen? Do we know?
Of course not. She wrote a series of 7 articles during this period that later, when they were going to Washington and pushing more, they published into a book about you know, the most important war of the West, or Battle of the West. So her work was right there, front and center. You want to know more? Here's what Lucille has written about it. And that happened again later, after it became a national battlefield, and was the big celebration in 1961, which of course was 100 years after the battle. The paper gathered up a whole bunch of her articles that she had written over the years and did a big supplement about, you know, the most important Western battle of the Civil War, which again was made available to the public, to all the thousands of people who came to the celebration.
So when she retires, does she exit public life completely?
It's a leading question.
It is.
Well, she
I'm
did.
leading you down a path.
She did, in fact. But a couple of years later, she was at dinner with a bunch of friends, and there had been one woman on Springfield City Council, Dr. Suter. I don't remember her other name, but she was retiring. And Lucille's friends said, hey, this is your chance. You know everything about what's going on in Springfield because you were a reporter. And you need to run for city council. And she said, ultimately, she said, if you guys will do the petition, and I don't have to do anything, then I'll let you put my name in on the ballot. So again, she wasn't going to participate, but she was front and center there. And she got elected as a council member at large. And she was on the council just one term. And I think it was 68 to 72 about. And one of the things that happened was that the National Council of Cities met in San Diego. And when she got to the meeting, they said, well, what are your different interests? You know, some of them were interested in tax reform and this and that and the other. And she was interested in historic preservation. Surprise. And they said, well, we'll get our historic preservation guy, and he can take you around old San Diego, and you can see what we've done in those terms. Turned out he was a guy that had been with the Historical Society in Missouri, and Lucille knew him as an acquaintance. So they spent good time together, and he told her that there was an ordinance in San Diego to preserve old buildings. He sent her, when she got home, he sent her a copy of the ordinance. She got city council to pass it, and that became the beginning of the, I think it's called the Landmarks Board today. And within a year, the board, which included 9 people with Lucille as the advisor, had picked 3 historic sites for the first 3. One of them is the Day House on South Street, which is marked. One of them was the Landers Theater, where the Little Theater performs now, still today. And the third one was the old Calaboose, the awful, awful looking jail. It looks like it's straight out of a Western movie, over by the Moxie Theater, which is now a police museum and is open on the first Friday nights for people to look at.
Big impact by this woman on our history here in Springfield and the Ozarks.
Absolutely.
Is really the summary of this.
Absolutely.
Huge history.
Yes.
Well, Susan, thank you for joining the Place for History.
I love it. Thank you so much for having me.